you ever wondered why the United States is the world's superpower? Most people might say it's because of their strong military technology or nuclear weapons. And yeah, those things are definitely a big deal. But here's a little secret. The US powerful weapon that might even be stronger than nukes. It's a system called the petrodollar. You might have seen news recently about teaming up to challenge the petrodollar or starting the de-dollarization. But what does that even mean? What is the petrodollar? Why so powerful? And why is it so controversial? So this video will explain all you need to know about the petrodollar. Section is the petrodollar. The word petrodollar comes from petro, which means petrol or oil, and dollar referring to currency. There's also a term called petro-yuan, which works the similar way but uses the Chinese yuan instead, but on the US dollar. So the petrodollar is a system where oil is traded exclusively using the US dollar around the world. In other words, no matter which country is buying or selling the oil, they will always do it using the US dollar. And just to clarify, dollar isn't a different type of currency. It's a system. So how does this petrodollar work? Let's break it down. A country rich in oil, like Saudi Arabia, sells its oil to other countries using the US dollar, not its own currency. So this is called petrodollar. Then, step 2. After Saudi Arabia gets those US dollars, it doesn't just keep to use it for themselves. Instead, they will reinvest those US dollars back to the US treasuries, bonds, and other US assets. You know, when you buy bonds and treasuries, you are lending your money to the government, and the government will repay you the money back. Plus, in this case, when Saudi Arabia buys US bonds and treasuries, it means Saudi Arabia lent their money to the US government. The US get easy money, but of course, in return, the US will pay Saudi Arabia the interest of the bond and treasuries, called petrodollar recycling. But why recycling? Because every time oil is sold, the US dollars in rich countries like Saudi Arabia flow back to the US economy through investments. When other countries are competing, hard to get loan from other richer countries or institution like the IMF. But for the US, thanks to the petrodollar system, oil is sold, the loans will just keep flowing in automatically. And not only that, bonds' interest rates are generally interest rates from other countries' loan, or IMF. So US not only getting automatic, but also cheap loan. Why the US made this system? How can the US impose this system? And how has an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia agreed? Well, we'll talk about it in the next section. Section 2, History of the Petrodollar. To understand how the petrodollar system, we need to understand first the history of the petrodollar. Before 1944, all currencies were tied to gold, called the gold standard. This meant that to print money, a country had to first acquire gold. If there was no gold, they couldn't. But during World War II, most countries, especially in Europe, drained their gold reserves during the war and had no their currencies. At that time, the US already had 70% of the world's supply of gold. So about 44 countries agreed to tie their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be tied to the euro. This system was called the Bretton Woods system. This made the US dollar as global currency, but it was still tied to this meant that to print more US dollars, the US needed more gold, which wasn't easy. At the same time, the US was spending more, the Cold War, and other big spendings, so it needed tons of money, but couldn't keep up with the gold standard. So, the US president at that time, Richard Nixon, just decided to make the US dollar not tied to gold anymore, which is called. Due to this, the value of the US dollar became more unstable, and leaving the US looking for a way to maintain the global dominance. Actually, you can watch more about this in my other video about fiat money. Well, yeah, it's kind of related. Link in the description. Let's move to Saudi Arabia in 1973. At that time, the Middle East was politically unstable, like the Yom Kippur War between Israel versus the coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. During this war, Saudi Arabia and most Arab countries supported Egypt and Syria, while the US and the West backed Israel. In response, Saudi Arabia led it against the West, causing an energy crisis with skyrocketing prices. But while the West struggled, the embargo Saudi Arabia's economy, as less oil sold meant less revenue. On top of that, Saudi Arabia still relied on U.S. global markets. Realizing that the embargo was harming both sides, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached an informal and secret 1974, commonly called the Petrodollar Agreement. Since the deal was secret, there's no official government. The agreement was simple. The U.S. promised military protection and support for Saudi Arabia, and in return, Saudi Arabia sell its oil only in U.S. dollar. Yeah, only in U.S. dollar, not in their own currency, which is Saudi. And not only that, Saudi Arabia also needs to reinvest those U.S. dollars from oil revenue back into U.S. treasuries. Simply said, when you buy government bonds, it means you lend money to the government. So when Saudi Arabia lent their money to the U.S., and this is called petrodollar recycling. Why is this important? Investing these dollars back into the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other oil-producing nations were lending billions of dollars from the U.S. The U.S. government would get those billions of dollars, which helped the U.S. to invest heavily on their economy and military. So many easy loans, the U.S. was not only able to maintain a strong military presence in the Middle East, but it also secured the flow of capital into its financial markets. This helped the U.S. keep the dollar as the world's dominant currency. Yet agreed, other oil-rich countries also followed the same things. Because at that time, only the U.S. was seeing technology and military to support and protect them. So by investing their petrodollars in U.S. assets, that their wealth was growing, as at that time, the U.S. economy was the biggest and fastest growing. So in short, the U.S. used the petrodollar strength of its dollar and its global influence, while oil exporting countries, especially Saudi Arabia, secured military economic stability. Now, your next question is, how did the petrodollar help the U.S. become the world's superpower? Well, what's section? Section 3. How important is the petrodollar to the U.S.? As previously mentioned, before that existed, the U.S. dollar was already the world's most in-demand currency, and the petrodollar system only made even more in demand. Why? Well, you might need oil in your daily life, from petrol, for your transportations, and much more. Simply put, all countries need oil. And if they want to buy oil from an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia, they need U.S. dollars. This made the U.S. dollar even more in demand, since all countries needed to buy oil. The U.S. is the only country that can print it. And that's why the U.S. has big influence on oil trade and price around the world. That's why if a country has oil, the U.S. seems very interested in them. The petrodollar recycle system also requires oil-rich countries to lend their oil money to the U.S. This gave the U.S. so much money to build its military, allowing it to remain the world's strongest country, at least for now. Lastly, the U.S. can actually weaponize the petrodollar. In countries that don't obey the U.S., it maintains global influence. How does this work? Well, we'll talk about it in the next section. Section 4. Why is the petrodollar controversial? After understanding the petrodollar, you might say that this system seems controversial, which actually it is. The first controversy is global dependency on the U.S. dollar. Oil importing countries must have U.S. dollars to buy oil, making them vulnerable to changes in the dollar's value. Imagine a country saving so many only to find their value weakening. And that's why U.S. elections, Federal Reserve rates changes, and U.S. political conditions are monitored closely by people around the world. The second controversy is U.S. control over global. Since oil exporting countries reinvest their petrodollars into U.S. assets, their economies become financially tied to. If the U.S. economy struggles, the value of their investments drops too. On top of that, most global oil trade oil in USD, which need to pass through U.S. regulated banks. If your country is on Uncle Sam's naughty list, impose sanctions, making it harder for your country to send or receive U.S. dollars. Well, if you want me to explain more about sanctions, in the comment section. Surprisingly, the petrodollar has one disadvantage for the U.S. Funny, right? The petrodollar system need to run trade deficits to maintain U.S. dollar liquidity. Here's why. When the U.S. exports goods it sells products, and other countries pay in U.S. dollars. But when the U.S. imports goods, it buys products and pays to other countries. For the petrodollar system to work, the U.S. must import more than it exports, meaning more U.S. dollars out into the world. This keeps the U.S. dollar circulating globally, making it easy for other countries, especially for buying oil. This is great for countries that need U.S. dollars for trade. But for the U.S., it means deficit because it buys more than it sells. Even though petrodollar recycling helps by giving the U.S. automatic oil sales to cover the deficit, it also explains why the U.S. has tons of debt. Ahem. If the U.S. exports more than it imports, more countries would be paying U.S. dollars back to the U.S., meaning dollars circulating outside the country. This would make it harder for other nations to get U.S. dollars for global trade, buying oil. If that happens, countries might start looking for alternative currencies instead of the U.S. dollar, which will dollar influence and domination. So the petrodollar comes with a cost for the U.S., but it seems accepts this as the price for maintaining its influence in the global economy and politics. The more demand there is for U.S. power the U.S. has. Now, you might be curious about the future of the petrodollar. Well, we'll talk about that in our next Section 5, Future of the Petrodollar. Now, you might be wondering, will the petrodollar stay forever? Well, sure it does have some challenges now. First is challenges from other countries. Recently, BRICS countries, Brazil, China, South Africa, and others, have planned to trade oil using their own currencies instead of the U.S. dollar. Saudi Arabia has discussed selling oil to China in Saudi riyals and Chinese yuan instead of U.S. dollars, called the Petro Yuan. As of 2025, Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich countries still use the Petro Yuan is still in talk. However, countries like Russia and Iran have started selling their oil in such as the Chinese yuan and the euro. So if this trend continues or succeeds, it could challenge the petrodollar. Is declining oil reliance. As the world moves toward renewable energy sources like solar and wind power, the demand for decrease. With less oil consumption, the need for the petrodollar could shrink, making the U.S. less able dominance to maintain global influence. Even though the world still needs oil and green alternatives are still replace it as of 2025, nobody knows what will happen in the future. Even if the petrodollar were abandoned, the U.S. would likely remain a global superpower. That's because the U.S. dollar isn't just supported by the petrodollar, deeply integrated into the global economy. However, losing the petrodollar would mean losing a key tool of influence in the U.S. to adapt to maintain its dominance. So if there's oil, well, you know who's knocking at the door.
Knock, knock, motherfucker. It's the United States of America, and I hear you guys got oil that isn't under my possession. Stove and return the oil to me before I have to resort to bringing democracy.
If you want me to make other videos like this, please like and subscribe.